Everybody has their teams that they play for, and there's ideology as part of it. But a lot of the time, a lot of these people, they're just petty and they just like to destroy people who they dislike. And so you can't just totally dismiss that aspect of it. It may just be something personal that they just personally hate Trump. And of course, they would deny that all day long because they're consummate professionals and they're not motivated by normal things that normal people are motivated by. They would never go after somebody for personal reasons. Obvious nonsense. But you are right. It does, and of course, Latin America is one of my particular interest areas in grad school and all of that. And I was always surprised because I was naive at the time, reading the separate histories of South American countries and so on. So many of these countries have a national hero, right, like George Washington type of figure, but at least half the time, that national hero, who everybody reveres, as soon as he's out of power, he gets either driven into exile or executed. This is how they roll in Latin America. Once you're out of power, well, it's my job now to destroy you, to investigate you. You're not allowed to just retire to the countryside. You either have to leave the country or be executed. So that seems to be sort of the drift that the Americans are going in. But part of that, of course, it's the expected outcome of making the federal government so powerful, right? What was different about those Latin American countries is that they were much more rules from the center in many cases. And they had this Caudillo model where you had this strong, powerful man at the center. And that's what really a lot of the power in a Latin American country revolved around. It wasn't all dispersed through all of these local states or through even just dispersed through institutions at the federal level. So you had to destroy someone who had his own personal following at the federal level because he could exercise so much power. And so we're still living, I think, with the results of this massive accumulation of power that occurred after the mid-20th century. And so now that presidents essentially rule by edict now, with so many executive orders now being the way they rule because the Congress doesn't pass laws or change laws like it used to. So now we'll just have the president do everything. And so now the president has a massive amount of powers, much more hero worship now even than before. In some cases, more personality driven. But it's all really as you say, the result of this real peak in power of these federal institutions that occurred, I think, in the mid-20th century. And that was the time where you had the press, you had private organizations, you had local schools really driving home how the federal government was virtuous and wonderful in every possible way and how the FBI was just an impeccable organization. And I always remember how the late Paul Cantor, he had a great book called Gilligan Unbound, and he had a whole chapter there on the X-Files. And the X-Files, and that chapter examined a lot about the FBI and its reputation, and why were the heroes of the X-Files FBI agents when the show was anti-FBI, right? But of course, the hero agents were odd men out, right? They were on the fringe of the FBI. The FBI central structure was corrupt to the core, was basically what that show was talking about. But I just remember in his discussion of the FBI in general, I think he really well summed up how Americans viewed the FBI in the mid-20th century, where he talked about a movie called The FBI Story, which I believe starred Jimmy Stewart. And the question was, how do we justify the existence of the FBI? Because there were still old-timer Americans who remembered that the FBI was this new invention and really actually wasn't necessary and also was not authorized in any way by the Constitution. But they just, hey, we're the federal government, Commerce Clause, blah, blah, FBI, now, fine, constitutional. And so there was a line he quoted in the movie about, like, some kid asked, why do we have the FBI? And the FBI agent says, well, Billy, the reason we have the FBI is because as the country grew, crime grew too, and now we need a federal law enforcement agency. And that was all it took for a mid-20th century American who basically would just believe anything people in Washington told him, because that's how people were in the mid-20th century. Just, they'd been brainwashed in school with the American flag and the picture of Abe Lincoln to just believe that if the federal government does it, it must be necessary. And so, the old timers still believe that. But I think some of the younger people are starting to wake up about what the nature of these organizations really is, even if it's still very vague. But yeah, I think that's the roots of the current situation, and has been going on for several decades now, really culminating in a massive amount of power in the early 90s and throughout the 1980s. And I don't think its power is really growing like it was, and I think it started to hit some real headwinds, but it had accumulated so much power over the 20th century. And you had, and it wasn't even just conservatives that were really supporting stuff, as Lou Ruggles pointed out to me, and it's true, of course. One of Ayn Rand's favorite movies was The Untouchables. Actually, it was her favorite show. That was a show before it was a movie. Which, I mean, just shows, right? Because she loved the idea of these highly effective federal agents attacking these irrational anti-life people or whatever. Just shows how ignorant, easily duped Ayn Rand was. Any show of power she worshipped, right? Military power, federal law enforcement power. She loved that because she just always imagined it was going to be used against the forces of irrationality or whatever people she hated. And so there was just this huge amount of just sit back and accept whatever the FBI is doing. And the fact that that no longer seems to be just gospel is a new thing. But because they've accumulated so much power, they can now basically behave like party hacks from Latin America, who like Fujimori's people, who just can go around the country arresting people, killing people, doing whatever to destroy his enemies in Peru. That's just how we roll now in this country. And so unless you really start to rein in these organizations, that's just something we're going to have to live with for the foreseeable future. But as you say, though, I think the only way to really fight that is to start getting some real pushback then at the state level. And that could be, I think, eventually states just out and out refusing to assist with FBI investigations and with arrests, and simply saying, we're not going to help you, because the FBI, of course, relies heavily on local law enforcement to help them out in a lot of cases. But you could theoretically have just state patrol just impede the FBI in its investigations in some cases. And of course, the feds would throw a fit and they would defund the state and they would sue the states and all of that. But that's really the only way, I think, to really make life difficult for the FBI. And then, of course, to stop giving them immense amounts of cash to stink at what they do, right? The FBI failed utterly with 9/11. I mean, just the level of incompetence is quite astounding that the FBI exhibited in the lead up to that disaster. But what did they get afterward? They got a pay increase. They got more money, and so that's just typical for an organization that's good at destroying political enemies, but really does very little in terms of actual law enforcement. I mean, the real work's done by state law enforcement, local law enforcement. The FBI just shows up and usually takes the credit for the work that others do in those sorts of investigations.